Water sprayed out of the giant rust-cold pipe like a geyser. I had just returned from town with a sack of feet in my truck when I spotted her, Karen, standing at the back of my ranch near the rainwater tanks, and she wasn't alone. Her husband, Brent, was holding a wrench while Karen looked around like she was inspecting stolen treasure. I slammed the brakes and jumped out of my truck. "What in the world are you doing?" I shouted. Karen didn't even flinch. She turned, slowly, lifted her sunglasses, and said, "Oh, calm down, Frank. This is HOA property. Now we have a right to inspect and drain anything that looks suspicious." Suspicious, those tanks didn't just serve my ranch. They were the only water source feeding the community garden just down the hill. A garden that provided food for elderly folks and struggling families in our neighborhood. Over 20 families depended on those vegetables every week. I had installed the collection tanks years ago with my own money and my own sweat. I even maintained the irrigation lines leading from my ranch down to the garden. All of it gone empty. I could hear the sound of the last trickle pouring out onto the dry dirt. And just like that, Karen turned her back on me and strutted off like nothing had happened. But it wasn't over. Oh no, that was the moment I realized something deeper, something uglier was going on. Because when I confronted her, she smiled and said, "Go ahead, report it. We are the HOA, remember?" My fists clenched. I looked at the cracked ground where the water once pooled and thought of the people who were going to go without this week, the elderly, veteran down the road, single mums who picked herbs and lettuce for dinner kids, who'd started learning how to grow food from that very garden all gone because Karen wanted to inspect something. And then something clicked in my head, something I hadn't considered until that very moment. There were cameras, not just mine but hers too. I wasn't the only one with eyes on this, what I did next. Well, let's just say it set a chain reaction in motion that neither Karen nor her little HOA gang saw coming. Let's go back to the beginning, because this all started long before those tanks were emptied. I live in a quiet, rural county outside Austin, Texas. Folks here used to mind their own business until the HOA came in. My name's Frank Whitaker. I'm 67 years old, a retired firefighter, and I own a 12-acre ranch that's been in my family for 3 generations. My wife, Linda, passed away 6 years ago. Since then, it's been me, my dogs, Max and Rosie, and a whole lot of projects to keep me busy. I built a greenhouse from recycled windows, started keeping bees, and I installed that rainwater catchment system that could make any off-grid homesteader proud. The system wasn't just for me. About a year back, the town council approved a community garden near the church, but they didn't have water access. I offered to supply the water free. I set up underground irrigation that ran from my tanks to the garden. Nobody asked me to. I just knew it was the right thing to do at first. Everybody appreciated it. But then came Karen, and Karen Myers moved into the neighborhood about 8 months ago, mid-50s, platinum blonde, bob haircut, and a clipboard always glued to her hand. She wasn't just a homeowner, she was the HOA, or at least she acted like it, her husband. Brent was quiet always, trailing behind her like a lost puppy, nodding along to whatever outrageous rule she was pushing. That week, Karen didn't like that I had rainwater tanks, unregulated, water storage, she called it. She didn't like that people came to pick veggies from the garden, either too much foot traffic, not safe, and she really didn't like that. I wasn't officially part of the HOA. Yes, you read that right. My ranch was not even part of the HOA. The line stopped 5 properties before mine, but Karen claimed that because I shared the same road, aesthetic consistency and community values applied to everyone, It started small. Karen sent me a letter about unauthorized fencing, then a complaint about my beehives being a danger, and once she left a note saying my rusty pickup truck was damaging the neighborhood's image. I laughed it off at first. Then one morning I found bright orange flags staked into my property line HOA survey markers, except there was no legal document. Behind it, just Karen. Trying to redraw boundaries with no authority, I called the sheriff. He told me he couldn't do anything unless she stepped inside the property without evidence. It was just a neighborly dispute. So I set up cameras quietly, all over the back section of my land, just in case. Meanwhile, I kept helping with the garden. I taught kids how to plant tomatoes and compost banana peels. Folks dropped by with jars of jam and notes that said, "Thank you," because they appreciated what the ranch was doing for the neighborhood. But Karen, she didn't thank anyone. One Saturday, she stood near the edge of my fence and took photos of children harvesting carrots when I asked what she was doing. She said, "If someone gets sick, I need proof that this was an unsanitary setup. It was insane. It was Karen." Still nothing could have prepared me for the day I returned from town and found those tanks dry, and just as I stood there staring at the cracked base of the tanks, wondering how much time we had before the garden died completely, my phone buzzed. A text from Emma. Emma is 29, a school teacher and the volunteer coordinator for the community garden. Her message read, "Frank, something's wrong, the garden's dry, everything's wilting. Was there a problem with the tanks?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I just saw, because the truth was worse than a malfunction. It was sabotage. And as I stood there in the sun, anger rising like the heat around me, I saw Brent peek back from behind their fence. I don't think he meant to be seen, but he was holding something in his hand, a wrench, still dripping with water. I dropped the bag of feed. My boots hit the ground hard as I walked to the back corner of my property. That's where I saw the first real evidence, muddy boot prints leading up to the valve, and the lock I had installed twisted completely off. They hadn't just drained the tanks, they broke the lock to do it, and that meant criminal trespass. Suddenly a loud bang echoed from the direction of the garden. I turned my head, smoke, no dust. I grabbed my keys and jumped back into the truck. What I found when I got there made my stomach drop. The back section of the garden had collapsed. A large portion of the raised beds had caved in, and standing right in the middle of it was Karen, wearing rubber gloves, holding a metal detector, and, beside her, a shovel, digging, looking around nervously, and she hadn't seen me yet. That's when I knew this wasn't about water, not anymore, and she was about to dig up something that never should have been touched. I slammed the brakes and stepped out of my truck as quietly as I could. Karen was still facing away from me, too busy stabbing the dirt with her little shovel like she was on some kind of treasure hunt. Her gloves were already brown with soil. She mumbled something under her breath. I couldn't make out the words. I crouched behind the wooden fence near the tool shed, peeking through the slats, and then it hit me. What on earth was she looking for in a community garden I had built, every raised bed myself? I knew what was under each row: compost, stones, drip, irrigation, tubing, and a whole lot of hard work, nothing more, unless she thought there was something more. I stepped around the fence, slowly but deliberately. "Karen!" I barked. She jumped and nearly fell backward into a patch of wilting lettuce. "Frank, you scared me. What are you doing?" I asked, voice firm but calm. Karen quickly stood, brushing dirt from her gloves. I thought I saw a snake. I was just trying to make sure the kids wouldn't get hurt by digging up a 2F deep trench in the middle of a vegetable bed. I pointed toward the fresh pit she'd been clawing at. She squirmed. "You never know what could be buried out here. And you never filed a proper environmental compliance form, did you?" There it was, the classic Karen move. Make up a rule, then accuse. "You of breaking it. What I do on my ranch and the water line that supports this garden has nothing to do with you. You're not in charge here." She gave a cold smile. "That's where you're wrong, Frank. I was elected to serve this community, and I've heard complaints, lots of them, about your tanks, about your water, about your activities." "Funny," I said. "I've heard thank yous from those same neighbors." I looked at the broken irrigation pipe now poking out of the edge of her dig site. One she had clearly snapped my gut. Churned that section, controlled the automatic watering system for the tomato beds that was a full season's crop now at risk. "What did you think you were going to find?" I asked again. Karen paused, and then she whispered, "I heard rumors about how you were hiding things in the garden. Barrels, chemicals, illegal compost, even maybe money." I blinked. "Money?" She stepped forward, eyes wide, with a strange mix of suspicion and greed. "People talk. Frank, they say your tanks are just a front, that you're using this garden to move something else. Why else would you need so many cameras and locks?" Now I understood. She didn't want control over the water. She wanted control over everything. And in her mind, the only explanation for someone doing something kind without payment was that they had a hidden agenda. That's how twisted her thinking had become. But I didn't let it show. I just said, "Get off my land and off this garden before I call the sheriff." She glared. "It's not your land. You gave it to the community, remember?" "No," I said firmly. "I offered to share it. Big difference." Karen stormed off, brushing past me so hard I nearly lost my footing. "You'll be hearing from the HOA," she snapped, as she disappeared into the trees. I sighed and crouched beside the ruined garden bed. I gently pushed the soil back over the pipe, trying to prevent further damage. Later that evening, I walked down to the church hall. Emma was inside with a few of the volunteers, watering what was left of the plants using buckets filled from nearby homes. The air was thick with worry. Emma looked up when I entered. "Frank, what happened? Did the tanks fail?" "No," I said, "they were drained on purpose." A collective gasp spread across the room. "Who would do that?" one of the mums asked. I looked at Emma. "You know who." Emma closed her eyes and leaned against the table. "She's out of control." We spent the next 2 hours trying to assess the damage. The beans and squash might survive a few days with hand watering, but the herbs were already dried out, and the tomatoes, if we couldn't get them water by morning, we'd lose them too. Then came the knock on the door. Sheriff Daniels stood in the frame, arms crossed, hat tilted low. "Evening, folks," he said. "I got a call from Mrs. Karen Myers. She's filed a report." Everyone stared. "A report?" I asked. He nodded. "She says, you've been storing unauthorized liquid waste on your ranch and using it to irrigate public land." The room exploded in murmurs. Sheriff Daniels raised a hand. "Now I know that sounds like a load of hogwash, but I'm obligated to look into it." Emma stepped forward. "Sheriff, this is ridiculous. Frank's been nothing but generous. He saved this garden." Daniels sighed. I know his reputation, but I have to follow up. "Tomorrow morning we're going to need to inspect your tanks, Frank." "Fine," I said. "Bring a notepad." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch with Max and Rosie curled at my feet, the crickets chirping louder than usual. My mind was spinning. Karen had officially declared war. But she made a mistake. She came onto my land. She damaged my property. She turned neighbors against me with lies. And I had proof. The camera footage was already uploading to a cloud server the next morning. As the sun rose over the ridge, I heard tires crunching down the gravel drive. A black county vehicle, then a second car behind it. Emma's Sheriff Daniels stepped out, followed by a younger deputy. Holding a clipboard, Karen's car came shortly after, her bright yellow scarf flapping in the breeze like some kind of victory flag. I led them around the side of the barn to where the rainwater tank stood. I opened the spigot. "Nothing, see," Karen said. "Smugly, he's already dumped it." I turned to the sheriff. "Sir, I'd like to show you something before you make any judgments." I brought out my tablet and pulled up the camera footage as it loaded. Karen folded her arms, her eyes narrowing, then the screen
lit up there. She was walking across the field with Brent, wrench in hand, tampering with the valve. Sheriff Daniels's face changed immediately. "Karen," he said flatly. "Is this you?" Karen laughed nervously. "It could be anyone I know. Your walk." He cut her off. "And I know Brent's baseball cap." Her jaw tightened. And then something happened that none of us expected. The deputy's radio crackled. "We've got a report from the church," the voice said. "Someone's broken into the donation shed. Looks like someone
was looking for cash." Karen's eyes darted. She turned fast, but not fast enough, because Daniels was already pulling out the cuffs, and right then, just before she could say another word, Brent ran. He bolted straight through the tomatoes, crushing the
vines and disappearing into the trees. And that's when I realized Karen and Brent weren't just busybodies. They were looking for something, and they believed it was buried right here on my ranch. Chaos broke out like a wildfire. "Stop him!" Sheriff
Daniels shouted, but Brent was already halfway across the garden, trampling rows of eggplant and bell peppers like a man possessed. I watched as he stumbled through the compost area, nearly slipped on a broken rake, and vanished into the woods behind the church parking lot. Karen stood, frozen, her face pale as dry chalk. She wasn't even trying to cover it up anymore. Sheriff Daniels turned to her slowly, like a man piecing together a puzzle that had been staring him in the face the whole time. "You want to tell me what your husband's running from?" Karen licked her lips and stammered, "This is a misunderstanding. We thought, well, someone told us." "Told you what?" He interrupted. Emma stepped up, arms crossed. "Told you there was money buried on
Frank's ranches that it... Karen didn't answer. She just kept shaking her head, like she could rewind the whole thing. With denial, the deputy came around from the cruiser with the cuffs ready. Sheriff Daniels looked at Karen one more time and said,
"You're under investigation for trespassing, vandalism, destruction of agricultural property, and now possible theft attempt." Karen finally found her voice. "I didn't steal anything." "But you sure destroyed a lot," Daniels replied, nodding to the now half-dead, garden-cracked irrigation pipes and broken beds as he cuffed her. Karen hissed, "You're making a big mistake. Frank, you think you're some kind of hero, but people talk, they know what you're hiding." "I've got nothing to hide," I said, "but thanks to you now I've got something to prove." Daniels placed Karen into the cruiser, while Emma and the rest of the volunteers just stood there stunned. Nobody cheered, nobody clapped. The silence said it all. A quiet storm had been brewing under all our noses, and Karen was only the beginning. Back at the ranch, I reviewed the rest of the security footage Brent had been sneaking onto the property more than once over the past month. Early mornings, late evenings. One time he even brought a flashlight and metal detector. He had clearly been looking for something. But why that night I sat in my study with a box from the attic, an old wooden crate that once belonged to my grandfather, Ray Whitaker. He was a stubborn man, tough as nails and twice as sharp. He built this ranch with bare hands and pride, but he also carried secrets inside the crate were letters yellowed with age. I'd never read them before. They were mostly addressed to a man named W. Langley and stamped from 1947, just after the war. One envelope caught my eye. It had no stamp, no address, just a note scribbled in pencil. "Keep safe under the old bell." I tilted. My head the old bell. That's when I remembered there used to be a school bell at the far edge of the property, long before the land became what it is today. It was where Grandpa used to host harvest festivals and teach neighbor kids about planting corn. The bell was gone now, but the stone base was still there. The next morning, I headed down to the edge of the field, with Max trailing behind me. The ground was dry and cracked. We hadn't had rain in nearly a week. I knelt near the stone base and pushed aside weeds and brambles. Something clicked underneath an old metal hatch, half rusted, almost invisible. I grabbed a crowbar and pried it open. Inside was a small tin box, sealed with electrical tape and mud. I carried it back to the ranch, like I was holding a bomb. When I opened it, my jaw dropped. Inside were 2 leather notebooks, a roll of ancient blueprints, and a velvet pouch. I untied the pouch. Gold coins, real ones, U.S. Mint, 1933. I stared at them, heart-pounding. These weren't just valuable. They were rare. My grandpa must have stashed them away after the war, maybe out of fear, maybe for safekeeping. But he never told anyone, and now somehow Karen and Brent knew. That explained everything. The digging, the draining, the obsession. But how? Who told them later that afternoon? I got a call from Pastor Green at the church. His voice was low and careful. "Frank, we had a break-in last night," I heard. I said, "No, not just the donation shed. Someone got into the filing room, the one with the land. Grant documents." That was it. Karen had been snooping around legal records, trying to find anything connecting the ranch to buried treasure. I thanked the pastor and hung up. Mind spinning back at the ranch, the deputy returned with news. Brent's truck was found abandoned near County Line Road. Still no sign of him. I didn't like it. A man that desperate doesn't just disappear. He plans. And I had a gut feeling Brent wasn't done yet that night. I locked everything, all the gates, all the outbuildings, even the barn, but around 3:10 I heard barking. Max was howling at the back window, nose pressed to the glass. I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight, heart racing. I crept around the side of the barn and saw it, a figure sneaking through the garden again. Not Karen, it was Brent, covered in dirt, wearing a backpack, holding something that glinted in the moonlight. I raised the flashlight. "Brent!" He froze, dropped the bag, and then he ran straight toward the tanks, not to damage them, to pour something inside. "Stop!" I shouted, my boots slamming against the earth as I sprinted after him. Brent twisted the cap off the smaller tank, the one that fed directly into the emergency irrigation lines for the greenhouse. His hand shook as he pulled a metal flask from his bag and began tipping it forward. I raised my shotgun, not to shoot, just to make a statement. "You pour that and you'll regret it." He flinched. The flask stopped midair. I could see it clearly now. The label was scratched off, but I knew what it was. Pesticide, concentrate, strong stuff, the kind that could destroy every plant it touched. One drop in the system would ruin the greenhouse beds for years. "Brent," I said, calmly, keeping my voice low and steady, "think about what you're doing. There are kids who eat from this garden. Seniors' families. You ruin this. You're not just hurting me. You're hurting all of them." He hesitated, breathing hard. His eyes were wild, sleepless, and rimmed red. "You don't get it?" he spat. She said there was gold, said it was buried near the tanks, that you'd never share it with the rest of us, that this whole water charity was just a trick. I blinked, stunned. Karen made this up. He nodded fast, like a desperate man grabbing on to the only story he had left. She said, we'd find something under the pipes. Something Rye left behind. She found a name in the land records. W. Langley said it was a code told.
Me, if I drained the tanks and started digging, we'd have proof. I slowly lowered the shotgun. There was something buried? I said, but it's gone now and it was never meant for either of you. Brent's hand trembled. Put the flask down, I said for a second. I thought he'd tip it anyway, but then he dropped it hard. The metal clanged against the tank. I stepped forward and kicked it away. He didn't fight, didn't run. He just dropped to his knees in the dirt. I didn't want it to go this far. He mumbled.
Just wanted to get out of that house, out from under her control. The patrol car lights pulled up. Minutes later, the deputies stepped out, followed by Sheriff Daniels. They cuffed Brent without a word. I watched in silence as he was driven away. The next morning I met Emma and the volunteers at the garden. We worked from sunrise until noon, replacing damaged irrigation, shoveling out collapsed beds and replanting what we could. The community came together like never before. Even Mr. Dalton, who'd never picked up a shovel in his life, was there, helping mix compost by lunchtime. The garden was showing signs of life again. We even hooked up temporary water barrels while the tanks were refilled. Emma looked at me and smiled. They thought they could take something from this place, but they didn't realize it's not yours or mine, it's ours. That hit me, because it was true. This ranch, this garden, this land was more than soil and seeds. It was community. Later that evening, I got a letter from the HOA board. Apparently Karen had been removed from her position after multiple complaints and legal issues. Her house was listed for sale the following week. Brent's bail was denied. But there was still one mystery left. A knock came on my door. 2 days later, it was Pastor Green. He held a dusty envelope in his hand. I found this while cleaning out the church attic. He said, "Figured it belonged to your grandfather." I opened it carefully. Inside was a photo. Black and white edges curled. It showed a young Ray Whitaker standing next to a man with a wide-brimmed hat. Scribbled on the back, Ray and W. Langley, 1946. Planting the dream attached was a note, "The land is the treasure. The water feeds the people. Never let greed poison the roots." I felt a chill. My grandpa didn't bury gold for wealth. He buried it as a message, a test, one Karen failed one. The rest of us passed. The story could have ended there, but it didn't, because 3 nights later I found something else behind the greenhouse. A trail of footprints, fresh ones leading toward the backfield, and someone had left a small wooden stake in the ground, painted red. I stared at it for a long time, heart-thudding. Karen was gone. Brent was locked up, but someone else was still looking. The red stake was driven deep into the earth just beside the old mesquite tree, where the land started to dip into the lower pasture. It was freshly painted, still sticky to the touch. No initials, no markings, just that haunting splash of red against the brown grass. Max growled beside me, low and uncertain. This wasn't over. That night I reviewed every camera feed on the property, the backyard, the barn, the drive. But the strange thing was nothing, no figure, no vehicle, no sign of entry, whoever left. That stake knew how to avoid being seen. At first, I thought maybe it was a prank, maybe some teenager with too much time and a bad sense of humor. But when I walked the perimeter of the ranch the next morning, I found 3 more stakes, one near the chicken coop, one behind the greenhouse, and the last one deep in the west pasture where the oldest pecan trees grew. Each one was driven into the soil at an exact depth, neat, precise, too precise. I took photos and removed them one by one, but I kept the red paint on my fingers. Something about it made my skin crawl. I placed all 4 stakes in the barn, locked the door, and called the sheriff again. "Karen and Brent are already being dealt with," Daniel said over the phone, "but I'll send a deputy by to take a look." By now the community garden was bouncing back. Thanks to the volunteers, the squash vines were climbing again, the bees were pollinating, and little kids were laughing in the dirt, like nothing had happened. But I couldn't relax, because someone else was still sniffing around. That evening Emma stopped by with a cooler of lemonade and sat on the porch swing. Next to me, she glanced down at the photos I had taken of the red stakes that's surveying. She said, marking a grid, "Someone's planning to dig." But where and why, I asked. She frowned. "You ever think there's something else buried out here? I mean, Karen clearly believed it." "I thought the gold coins were it," I replied, "but maybe they were just the tip of the iceberg." The next morning, I got an anonymous letter in the mailbox, no stamp, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, not handwritten. The map: "Never left the land. Look under the tree stump with the old horseshoe." I read it 3 times. It sounded like something
straight out of a spy movie, but I knew exactly what it meant. Back behind the west pasture, near the edge of the fence line, there was an ancient tree stump I'd never cleared. Grandpa always said it brought luck. Hammered into it was an old rusted
horseshoe, nailed sideways. I hadn't thought about that stump in years. So that afternoon, just before sunset, I went out there with Max and a crowbar. The air was thick and heavy. A storm was rolling in from the north, and the wind kept shifting, like it couldn't make up its mind. I approached the stump, slowly feeling like I was walking into something sacred or cursed. I tapped around the horseshoe and then pried it loose. The wood groaned as I dug into it, piece by piece. Then about 6 in hit something hard metal, a tin box, smaller than the last one, maybe the size of a lunchbox. I pulled it out gently and opened the lid. Inside, a faded map, drawn by hand on what looked like old linen. It showed the outline of my property, but from decades. Go fences in different places. No community garden, no rainwater tanks, but right near the center, marked with a faint red X, was a spot that didn't match any of today's landmarks, a spot that now sat directly under my barn. I felt a shiver run up my spine, the same barn where I'd stored the red stakes. I folded the map and headed back, dust swirling around my boots. When I reached the barn, I stopped short. The door was open, wide open. I always locked it, always. I stepped inside carefully. Tools were scattered. The stakes were gone. Every single one. I turned, slowly, heart hammering. Then I heard it, footsteps just outside the back of the barn. I rushed through the side door and caught a blur of movement in the distance. A figure, tall hooded, dressed in dark clothes, slipping into the woods beyond the fence, too far to catch, too fast to follow. But I wasn't about to let this go. That night I set up new motion lights. I added trail cams. I even wired a silent alert to my phone if anything moved near the barn, and at 2:47
my phone buzzed. Motion detected back of the barn. I grabbed my flashlight phone and a metal bat. When I reached the barn, the lights
flicked on, and there it was, a fresh red stake this time. It wasn't in the ground. It was stabbed directly into the barn wall, and hanging from it was the old horseshoe, cleaned, polished, tied with red twine. I stepped back, cold sweat pouring down my
neck. This wasn't just someone searching for treasure anymore. This was a message, and I had the gut-wrenching feeling the real danger was just beginning by sunrise. I was already on the phone with Sheriff Daniels again. "You need to come out here now," I said, my voice tight. 30 minutes later, he and the deputy were standing in the barn with me, staring at the red stake still embedded in the wooden wall. The horseshoe twirled slightly with every breeze, as if mocking us all. Daniel squatted
and inspected the stake. "You said they were all stolen from this barn?" I nodded, and now someone's returned one just to drive it into your wall. Looks that way. Whoever's doing this, he muttered, they're not just looking for something. They want you to know they're looking. He dusted for prints, nothing useful. No tire marks, no boot impressions. This was someone careful, calculated. Later that afternoon, I showed him the linen map I'd found in the stump. He scanned it with interest, then placed it on the hood of his cruiser, comparing it to a modern print out of the property lines. This red X, he said, it lines up almost exactly with the center of your barn, so what's under there? I asked. I've never dug it up. I just store tools and feed Daniels. Rubbed his chin. Well, you want to find out? I think I have to. We returned the next day with a county-approved dig, per permit. Emma showed up with a thermos of coffee and a curious look. Are we really doing this? I gave a tired laugh. Emma, we've come this far, may as well find out if Grandpa buried a dragon down there. Daniels brought a ground-penetrating radar technician from the nearby agriculture college. The guy was young, full of techie talk, and wore sunglasses even indoors, but after 2 sweeps of the barn's center, he pointed to the monitor. There's something down there roughly 4x4. FT could be a metal box, could be concrete.
Concrete? Emma asked. He nodded. Yes, sometimes folks bury safes in concrete to protect from weather or theft. Whatever this is, it's dense. I rented a small excavator, and we started the dig about 4 FT down the bucket. Struck something hard.
I got down on my knees and used a crowbar to clear the rest, bit by bit. A slab of old concrete emerged, framed by wooden beams. Emma helped clear away the dust, while Daniels knelt beside me. In the center of the slab was a rusted handle we exchanged. Looks, then I pulled the concrete cover, lifted with a grunt, and there it was, a steel safe, sunken deep into the earth, unmarked, locked. Daniels leaned over. You know the code. I shook my head. No idea. We called in a local locksmith who cracked it open. With surgical precision, after an hour of focused work, the door creaked. Everyone leaned in. Inside the safe were stacks of journals, old ones, leather-bound and tied with twine, and in the bottom corner a sealed wooden box. Daniels opened the wooden box carefully and let out a low whistle. Inside were more gold coins neatly arranged in velvet slots. Alongside them was a badge, military issue. Ray Whitaker, U.S. Army Intelligence Division. Daniels raised an eyebrow. Your grandpa, he said slowly. Wasn't. Just a farmer. I picked up one of the journals. The first page was dated June 5th, 1944, D-Day. I turned a few pages and read aloud. They said I couldn't bring anything home, but I knew what I had was too important to leave behind if something happens. To me, let it be known this land carries more than crops. Daniel stared at the coins, then at the journals. You know what this means, he asked. This land, this barn is technically hiding government property, Emma whispered. What if that's what Karen was looking for all along? Daniel stood up slowly. I think this explains why someone's still after it. Brent and Karen may have stumbled onto some of the rumors, but someone else knows the truth. Someone smarter, someone still out there. He stepped out of the barn and radioed the station back inside. I sat with the journals in my lap, flipping through decades of secrets my grandfather had kept, coded messages, reports, sketches of operations. I couldn't begin to understand he hadn't just fought in the war. He documented it, preserved it, and buried it for reasons only he knew. That night the barn was sealed off under state order. The sheriff posted a guard at the gate, and word spread fast around town. Reporters started calling. Neighbors stopped by asking questions, but the worst came 2 nights later at exactly 3 a.m.
The motion sensors tripped again. This time I didn't grab my flashlight. I reached straight for the camera feed. A figure stood near the barn. Not Karen, not Brent. Someone taller, slender, and wearing all black. They didn't run this time, they just
stood there looking straight at the camera. Then they pulled something from their coat and held it up a red stake, and in their other hand, a match. The barn lit up. Seconds later, flames roared into the sky. By the time I ran outside, the fire had already spread through the roof, the journals, the safe, the coins, everything, burning flames, swallowed the barn like a beast unleashed. My boots pounded against the gravel as I sprinted toward the fire, with Max barking behind me, smoke already choking the
air. I grabbed the extinguisher from the side shed, but I knew it was useless before I even pulled the pin. The heat was too intense. The blaze was roaring from the inside. Whoever lit it knew exactly where to strike. The sirens arrived within minutes.
Sheriff Daniels, the fire department, even a few neighbors in their pajamas came rushing with buckets, but it was too late. By dawn, all that was left was a smouldering skeleton of beams and ashes, the barn gone, the journals gone, the safe melted. The gold coins, if any had survived, they were fused into worthless lumps of metal. Daniel stood beside me with his arms folded, jaw tight. This wasn't random, this was a cover-up, a professional one. He pointed to the camera on the tree. We've got a face. Now when we're going to find them. But deep down, I knew the person in black was long gone. They didn't come for treasure. They came to erase something later that morning. Emma and I stood where the barn used to be. She looked around, then down at the
scorched ground, all that history, she whispered. All those stories, some things I said, they don't get burned. They live on in the people who carry them. She nodded. Then we carry it that afternoon while walking through the garden. I heard laughter a little.
Kids playing tag between the rows of tomatoes, parents watering the plants. Even Mr. Dalton was on a stool, fixing the bird netting. Despite the ashes, just a few 100 feet away, the garden was alive. I realized something as I stood there watching. Them Karen and Brent had tried to control the land. The stranger had tried to erase it. But this, the joy, the togetherness, the community, was something they could never touch. A few days later, Daniels called. You were right about your grandfather, he said. We had the army run his service number. He was in the intelligence division, all right. Coded communications, smuggled artifacts, protected war relics for future documentation. But more than that, I held the phone tighter. He was tasked with hiding
evidence of looted treasures and stolen Nazi gold. But your grandpa, he didn't hide their gold. He hid his notes about where they went. My knees buckled. Whoever burned the barn, it wasn't after gold, no. Daniel said they were after truth. Truth he buried.
And now it's gone. Or so we thought. The very next week, while I was rebuilding the barn foundation with some volunteers, Max started barking near the fence line. He had found something, a waterproof container, buried under the fig tree. I opened it. Slowly, heart pounding again inside, was a copy of one of Grandpa Ray's journals, a duplicate dated 1947 marked, in case they find the first. The opening line read, if you're reading this, it means someone came looking not for treasure but for silence. You must decide, protect the land or expose the lie. I sat down right there in the dirt, surrounded by people who had come to help rebuild, and I knew what I had to do. Weeks later, I handed the journal to a local historian. They documented it, digitized it, and submitted it to the National Archives. We made sure Ray Whitaker's voice lived on, and as for the ranch, we rebuilt the barn stronger. And this time we carved something into the new foundation. This land feeds the people, not the greed. Karen was never seen again in our community. Brent was sentenced to a year in county jail for property damage, but I heard he quietly moved states after release. As for the person in black, they never returned. Maybe they knew they lost Maybe they were just hired hands in a game bigger than us all, but my ranch, our garden, survived, not because of locks, not because of cameras, but because of people who showed up when it mattered. And now whenever I sit on my porch, watching the sunset behind rows of green and gold, I remember one thing: they tried to poison our roots, but we grew back even stronger.